Hi SwitchUp family, my name's Mark Walker if you don't already know. Buckle up because yeah, we're in for a bumpy ride. Avatar: The Last Airbender Quest for Balance releases on the Nintendo Switch today, so I thought you might want to know a few things about it. Firstly, we'll have a look at the performance, we'll look at frame rates as well in docked and handheld modes, and have a bit of a discussion around the engine they're using before we go on to that gameplay. I wouldn't call myself a super fan, but I do enjoy the anime, and I know there are a lot of adults out there as well that enjoy it. So let's see if it's an adult experience, or if it is an unbalanced mess. Well, my name's Mark Walker, welcome back to SwitchUp. Now, let's find out. Let's dive straight in at the deep end with frame rates. And oh my goodness, here we go. You are looking at around about 24 frames per second to begin with, and it might crawl its way up to 30 from time to time. But if we look at a few different areas across the game, frame rates really are unstable. Now this one looks to be using the Unreal 4 engine, and we know that's been used several times on Switch, and clearly they've started to use some of the more modern techniques to avoid the blurry image. Things like a combination of FSR and dynamic resolution scaling. It means that, well, as far as resolution goes, we're not in 540p territory, and actually at times it can have quite a crisp image. But honestly, I think their focus should have been on that frame rate, whether it's fighting, using your airbending abilities, switching between characters and using theirs, or just moving around and traversing the world. That frame rate severely hinders the overall gameplay experience. Then you factor in another pet peeve of any Nintendo Switch player, especially one that enjoys handheld mode, and that's text size. This has to be some of the most ridiculously minuscule text I've ever seen. What were they thinking? Someone must have picked this up to test the game. Now either they're Superman with 50-50 vision, or they just didn't bother looking. The text box is also not even centered, and it's beginning to feel like a cheap and lazy port for the Nintendo Switch, where they know they're going to get sales because it's such a big name. Now the image quality itself, well, I've mentioned that the resolution's okay. You will notice artifacting in areas of shadow. This is related to the upscaling that I believe is taking place, and the dynamic resolution scaling. But there's also some pop-in of scenery, which is weird because it's top down, and they seem to appear and disappear when you move closer and further away, even though the camera isn't actually any further away as it's from a top-down perspective in these areas. Visually it isn't all terrible, there are a few nice cutscenes, but the animations are also pretty weak, feeling straight out of PlayStation 2 era, but with worse performance. To its credit, load times are reasonable, although it makes the mistake so many other games have of having 3D character models within the menus, so that when you try and switch to that screen in the menu, it will suddenly stop, because behind the scenes it's struggling to load the asset. We've seen that the game has some slight level of detail draw distance issues, but my goodness, you wait till we get to the actual gameplay and controls. To give it one positive at least, the character models at least look like their counterparts, and those cutscenes can look okay. Everything else from the visual perspective is subpar, lazy and quite disappointing.
No!
Now Avatar as a series has a wonderful soundtrack and some excellent voice acting to fall back on. Did they decide to use that here? Well, yes and no. There's some nice music within the game, but again, that's few and far between. Sound effects are minimal. When you're fighting in combat, there's no punch to it, no pun intended. There's just very little audio feedback. It feels like the team went on to YouTube and typed in free sound effects and then just used one lot that they found for the whole game. It is weak. Audio fidelity's not terrible, and there are a couple of lines, and I mean a couple, that are voice acted.
Stop hiding behind these little girls, Avatar. They can't save you.
The rest, you're relying on that wonderful on-screen text. On balance then, and being as fair as I can, the visuals and performance, they score 8 out of 20. Sound and audio, that also scores 8 out of 20.
As did Appa, and they plunged into the ocean. The Avatar and his bison remained.
The game covers the broad story arc of Avatar starting from the first book in broad strokes. These are often narrated, static cutscenes, and very occasionally there's some spoken words, but usually you're reading these tiny little text boxes. Now, as far as gameplay goes, I was recently chatting to someone in the comments who ironically mentioned to me how much they hate it when a game just becomes a huge tutorial. Now, I understand that Avatar has a younger audience as well as an older one, so tutorials are something that you would expect. Unfortunately here, they are are forced on you for a huge chunk of the game. They can't be disabled, they're incredibly basic, and they're constantly breaking up the action with, quite frankly, inane suggestions. I think most players are capable of pressing a few buttons to figure out they need to jump, and when you see an interactable object, well, you're most likely going to interact with it. I don't need a tutorial pop up just as I go to do that to tell me, hey, why don't you open that box? Now, it makes more sense when in combat, teaching the lock-on mechanics, the dodge move, that's fair enough, but the sheer number of them, with about 10% being useful and not being able to turn these off, yeah, it's not a great look. Then there's the platforming. Now, many times the camera takes a side perspective. You can slightly adjust the camera with the right stick, but that doesn't stop the camera from becoming occluded. Objects will block it, or you just won't have the angle to be able to see if you're going to land a jump. It can lead to some cheap respawns and some mild frustration before you get into combat. Now, combat can put you inside a gated area where you can lock onto enemies, supposedly, although that seems a bit hit and miss, and then perform your different moves. You have cooldown based skills. You can switch between the other characters and use theirs, and it feels pretty damn terrible. It's like your punches and your airbending skills are just whiffing around, not touching anything. It's a combination of the audio and visual feedback and a lack of real responsiveness from the controls that will have you facing in the wrong direction, unable to lock onto enemies, and once again it takes me back to who actually this game's targeting, because although the main game's very easy, combat can have these huge difficulty spikes. Now, the first boss is very easy indeed, but the second one, I can't see any child that would actually be able to finish it. And it had one of those moments, I don't know if you've ever experienced this, where you're fighting a boss and you're dying not because it's stupidly difficult, but because you're bored. And there's only one specific attack that will do any damage, and it takes ages to whittle their health bar down. That was basically my experience before the second boss, and then that enemy died and the actual boss dropped in, and yeah, not great. Now, as far as gameplay design, it's pretty linear with its platforming and its combat interspersed. There are some side quests, and you'll find chests that give you those pie show tiles to upgrade different areas, and there's a skill tree here for each of the characters that you can switch between, and after levels you gain permanent skill upgrades, but like many of the aspects here, it feels like a token gesture. Probably its strongest point are some of its puzzles, but even those bear the marks of old games. Things like you can double jump, but as soon as you pick up a torch, you can't jump at all. And when the wall is no higher than your shin and you need to get round it, it just feels odd not being able to just, I don't know, lift up your leg. I mean, he's the last airbender, but he can't step over a knee-high block. Ay caramba. To keep the gameplay fresh, between the stages you have races. Now, if you ever played the old Flash racing car game where you had 3 lanes, you had to move between them, then jump over obstacles, well, that's basically what they've done here. Sometimes your vehicle will change, but the basic premise remains the same, and you're trying to get the prerequisite number of tokens to finish. If that sounds fun, well then I've failed to do my job, because it isn't. And you know that's the case when your 10-year-old daughter says, "What on earth are they doing here? Why can't I control this properly? This isn't fun," and then walks off. If your idea of a fun time is lots of invisible barriers, weak, lifeless combat, and bad performance, then jump in. For me though, gameplay is completely uninspiring and doesn't make any real use of the license. The one redeeming factor here is that you can play through the whole thing with a friend in co-op, or you can jump online and do the same. And for that alone, I guess it can have one more point on the gameplay. Gameplay scores 6 out of 20. Controls don't fare much better, but they're certainly more enjoyable than the gameplay. They score 10 out of 20. Avatar: The Last Airbender Quest for Balance will set you back £39.99 or your regional equivalent, and it can be had physically. You can play 1 or 2 players, I believe, in co-op through its 18 chapters. It includes 9 of the iconic characters from the series, but a combination of poor design choices, very bad performance, and unfulfilling combat means I couldn't recommend it at all. If you're a super fan and you found this on an 80 or 90% discount, then maybe, but for everyone else, I would be recommending you to avoid it. Value scores 6 out of 20. I don't particularly like being the bearer of bad news, but for me, Avatar: The Last Airbender Quest for Balance was a very disappointing experience. I can't really even say there are some nice ideas in here, as everything's basic or by the books, with worse performance than what I'm used to. It gets a SwitchUp score of 38%. Let us know in the comments, is this one you've had your eye on? Apologies if I was harsh, but yeah, I mean, hopefully it spoke for itself. But thanks to all of you that do enjoy the content. Tickle some buttons, leave a comment down below, let me know your thoughts. And as always, for all things Nintendo Switch all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers, guys. See ya!